Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, to be able to give this talk. I'm aware that there's a fairly wide range of interest and knowledge and interest in this group, so I'll try to stay as general as possible. I have an outline set as this. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's the goal of encoding music notation, what we want to do when we want to encode music notation in a fairly general way. I'll then present a little bit the goal of the Music Encoding Initiative, so that's the correspondent of the TI, but for music. And then I'll take one case, which I call an illustration case. So it's not necessarily the main topic of the talk, but I'll illustrate this discussion with the question of the durations in Renaissance music. So that's fairly specific, a little bit technical in terms of music, but I think it's going to be fairly easy to follow. And then I'll end up with how all this question of encoding, representing music notation relates to the development of tools, and more specifically, how we can then interact with this type of data. So if we take notation and look at the informational context we have in notation, even with one single note, we've got quite a few domain and quite a few contexts that are touched by this. Of course, we have first the pitch. This is just one note. There's the duration that's given here with the stem and the flag on the note. We have information. We can have information about the dynamic, how loud the music is supposed to be played, articulation, the dots, the pitch inflection that relates to the key, the parts, the tempo, and so on. So this works quite differently from text, where in text we have an alphabet that didn't change that much over the last centuries, with a vocabulary that evolved somehow, but the alphabet and the way we write the text didn't change, and we don't have in music this idea of a finite set of symbols, but it's a completely structural system that evolved fairly significantly over time. So if we go through music notation, we'll find some very interesting examples, somehow extreme, and we'll go fairly back. This is a manuscript from Baud Cordier, so this is Ars Subtilior for around 1400. And it was an interesting time where they were trying to put some symbolic in the music notation. So here we have the music that's, of course, written in this circle, par tout compas recomposé, because it's I'm all around, so to speak. And what's interesting is that there's a text of the music in the circles plus one on the top that explain how this score is supposed to be read. So there's the manual for reading the piece that's given here. So these are all fairly extreme cases. There's another one here, so we can listen to that. So obviously we were able to understand this notation to read it, so pretty efficient. Now if we jump, stay with circles. Probably all know that all music notation is not written in circles, but these are two of them. And again, to illustrate the structural and completely free way of functioning from the music notation, composers just adapt it as they need. And what's interesting here is that even though it's might be completely innovative, a musician can come and understand that. So if we think a little bit about music representation in a wider context, we have, of course, we can say that on one side we've got the music, the sound that's what we want to hear in the end. And this is then transcribed into a score by the musician, the composer. So the score serves at interface with the musician. And what's interesting is that we have we find the same in the analog domain and in the digital domain, which is that, in a way, if we compare what we have in the music and in the file, in an audio file, there's no explicit structure of the music. The only explicit structure you have is actually the track on a CD, right? There's no other explicit structure. Whereas in the score, you have, in an encoded score, you have a fairly high encoded structure, explicit structure that goes to the, of course, each note, but each voice, and so on. So this is a little bit the two extremes. And it's interesting to see in music notation there's actually a fairly wide range of somehow intermediate notation system. We can put, of course, where to put them exactly is a little bit arbitrary, but we have some graphical notation from the 20th century that actually, in a way, go back to the original of being an image of the sound, which we have also in the Neum notation. That's how music notation basically was invented. We've got tablaturas that show how to play and so on, which in a way might be fairly analog to MIDI. Right. So when we encode this, we actually, in a way, concentrate on this side. And there's a fairly wide range of intention different application we might want to do with encoding. That's typesetting is one. We might want to do some digital editing. Of course, it's important to also have data for searching the music, right? As I said, with text, once we've got the letters, we can search. We also want to have similar things for music. It's important to have encoded for bibliographic description. I work for a project that's called RISM, so the Répertoire International des Sources Musicales. And that's a project where very early, already from the 60s, there's been the idea of encoding some little extract of the sources in order to be able to identify the music. Right? If you take a mass from an anonymous composer that has the same tonality across different sources, there's nothing that lets you identify this piece or to compare with another. So that's where the content, the incipit, is important. So incipit and bibliographic descriptions. We might want to do analysis, interchange. That's changing data between different type of application, sound generation, and so on. And of course, around this, all these intentions are linked. If you look typesetting, there's, of course, it can be printed, it can be online, it can be dynamic, scholarly editing. Digital editing can be scholarly. You want to make a critical edition online, but you might want also to make a performing edition, and so on. So that's really a fairly wide scope of all the things we might want to do with this coded music notation. So the next question is, what codes? And here, I could make a very, very long list because there are actually hundreds of these codes that have been designed for representing music notation. One of the oldest, which is why I name it here, not necessarily the most widely used nowadays, but one of the oldest is DARMS. Then there was Plain and Easy that I mentioned for the rhythm that we use for encoding this little incipit. That's the very beginning of music encoding. Then Folk Songs has its own format. I mentioned already MIDI, which is not a standard but widely used, also in relation with sound application. Another one that's important, Muse data, that I'm mentioning again later, and so on and so on. Really hundreds of codes. Humdrum analysis, and actually this book from Eleanor Selfridge-Field, that's a collection of articles that present different type of code. That's been the reference, even though it's fairly old, but it's still a very good reference. The other thing we've seen is a lot of binary data. Right? Many scores have been actually transcribed using commercial software applications, and for different reasons, some being purely commercial, some also because of the space at the beginning of when developing this application. They use binary format, and we don't exactly know what's behind that. So that's what we have. So I mentioned application. So we can think about encoding, again, to be a very generic level in terms of application. So there's clearly the sound application, which I'm not going to cover directly today, but that's one type of codes, one domain where we have some fairly specific codes. Then there's a notation application, so the application that deal with the engraving. And then one group is more analytical, that want to then process the data, make analysis, and so on. And one good way to actually try to make the difference between this code is to look at how they would encode a pitch. Right? In a sounding application, what's relevant is the sounding height, sounding pitch, and typically a MIDI code will not make the difference between an F sharp and G flat. Right? It's the same note. Right? If you're doing a sound application, you don't care in a way. Similarly, for a notation application, you won't care about the sounding. So you can say that the note is stored on the second staff of second line of the staff, and if it's in G clef or an F clef, it doesn't really matter. That's how DAMs work. Right? And then the analytical try to go a little bit further and group this and store actually the pitch, the octave, and the accidental. Right? That's the three domain and an easy way to understand the difference between how they handle pitch. So let me take one example of a code, which is not directly a code, but I explain why I'm taking this example, which is Lily Pond. I think it's a good example for all the people who know LaTeX, because it's basically a LaTeX environment for music notation. Right? So people have been thinking, oh, we have LaTeX for typesetting text and thing. We should do the same thing for music. So it's all using marked up commands, so very similar syntax, but its own compiler. And of course, the idea there is exactly as in LaTeX. You typeset your music, and then you can produce printed output, PostScript or PDF. And it produced some very high quality typesetting for fairly complex score. And that's a really powerful tool. Right? It's modular, it's extendable, and I'm finished with this thing, which is like, again, it's not a WYSIWYG application. It's exactly like LaTeX. You typeset your score, and then you get it processed and output. That's one example of the code. One other one is this music XML, which I already mentioned. And it started actually as an XML representation of muse data. And that was around 2000. There were several people who started to think, oh, why not using XML for encoding music? And for music XML, it started, as in many other projects, they took an existing code and turned it into an XML representation. So that was the beginning of music XML. And it's quite widely used, and it's really designed as an interchange format. As I said, we have many applications that produce binary files, and users want to be able to exchange their data, so that's been a market target for music XML, a way for providing people to exchange the data from different applications. It's developed by one person, Michael Good, and it's owned by Make Music. So it's fairly commercial oriented. It's not a standard, right? Technically speaking, it's just a product of a company. And now it's discussed, and it's been discussed as part of a W3C music notation community group. Right, so where this thing will go is now under discussion, and It's going to be interesting to follow, right? And I put this little image taken from their website. So really this interchange, wide range of application, can read music XML, can write music XML, and it's used as an interchange format. So I selected these two examples because I think they're all very interesting, widely used, and powerful, but they have limitations because of the approach they have. And I think it's important to be aware of that. For Lily Pond, I guess it's very similar to what you will have with LaTeX. It's notoriously difficult to parse outside the environment, outside the Lily Pond environment. And we know that with LaTeX, you can convert it to HTML, but that works pretty well as long as you have very simple LaTeX. If you've installed some nice little package that do a lot of things, then you'll be probably a bit stuck, and that's a limitation and can be quite annoying in practice, right? Related to this, the complexity of this, the structure can be very complex because music notation is complex. And again, it's for typesetting, and that works pretty well. But then, in terms of parsing, you have a very high complexity, and that's difficult to handle outside the Lily Pond environment. And I guess the most fundamental point is that even though it's not a WYSIWYG, so you typeset the music in one side and then produce a score, all the typesetting is actually driven by the output you want to have. So some people have been comparing, like, what can I obtain with this tool and what can I obtain with Lily Pond, and say, okay, Lily Pond is much better because it straight away produces a very nice layout. I think it's a little bit dangerous to compare like this because, again, in the engraving, in the typesetting, you put a lot of knowledge of these engraving rules, and there's actually a lot of knowledge that's put into the structuring by the human in the end. Now for music XML, that's turned into a little bit lower level aspect, but of course it's XML, so that's fairly easy to handle and to manipulate. But there are some limitation, we can say, due to the procedural structure that is driven by how existing tools will process the data. So again, it's been designed as an interchange format. There were tools, and it was designed to work with these tools. And I illustrate this with one example where we have one note and then one chord with 3 notes and then another note. And you can see that actually the chord is encoded by putting like a flag in the note element, and you have only 2 of them, right? So the first note of the chord, this one, you cannot know that it's part of the chord until you've processed the data, right? And nothing tells you that this is the end of the chord. It's only by processing the data that you can actually understand the structure. So it's highly procedural in that sense. And that's, of course, and that's legacy from, you can understand where this comes from. There were a time where encoding this information, like 1 bit in memory, was too expensive. And that was a way to save memory, and it's still there. And that's, in a way, quite problematic because it doesn't give you a sense of the structure of the data, but it's only the processing of it that tells you it. There's actually other problems where we have in the encoding like some sort of cursor that can move back and forth. So basically, you read your content, and then there's something that tells you, okay, now go back here and read it again for the next voice, right? Or go back here and go forward, go back here and go backward. So if you look at some data, you don't know where you are. So it's highly procedural. And this is, it works for interchange, but when you want to do other things with the music notation, it's quite problematic. So this is the reason why, not the reason, but one other approach is the music encoding initiative, and that's been started by Perry Rowland from the University of Virginia about the same time as the music XML. And it was inspired already at the time by the text encoding initiative, started directly in XML. And one strength is that it's not developed by one person, but it's developed by a fairly large community. It's completely open and community-driven, so people can provide their idea and discuss. It covers a wide range of applications. I'll come back to that. And also what's interesting is that it accommodates not only common Western music notation, but it's meant to accommodate a fairly wide range and open range of music notations, right? With the idea that even though there will be difference in how you encode the notation, but there's concept you can share across different types of music notation, including all the metadata and so on, right? So in a way, and that comes back a little bit to the difference we have with LilyPond and Music XML, MEI models the music notation and tries to represent it digitally in a structured and meaningful way, in an application and tool agnostic way. So it's really trying to model the music notation. And also, one other main difference is that it makes explicitly the distinction between the different domains, right? And that's one issue with other code, is that everything is put without explicitly specifying to what domain we relate in the encoding. And as you can see, it's illustrated here. It can be used in fairly wide range of application. There are projects that uses for library catalogs or thematic catalog. It can be used, of course, digital edition. That's in a way the main target of this initiative. Long-term archiving too. It's now recommended by the Library of Congress, an archiving format, and so on. Right. So one slide to show a little bit the history. It started very slowly because, Perry Rowland started that. And that's, I think, what in the end makes the strength of MEI is that it was really developed at an abstract level. So there was no influence, no bias by tools, but it was really thought and developed at an abstract and theoretical level. And we can see this in this little time frame. It took a long time at the beginning, and now it's been really increasingly adopted by projects. And we have a conference every year. Next one is going to be in Montreal in 2016, 2017 probably in Europe. So in case you're interested, you should follow that. And there's really a lot of activity around MEI. And as I said, fairly wide range of music notation types has displayed here. Neum notation, so there's way to encode neums. Renaissance music, tablatures, that's being there's work on tablatures more specifically, and so on. And again, the advantage is that even we have different data at the music level, they can share a lot of concepts, they can share the metadata, and so on. So we want to do a lot of things, but again, it's structured. We have some modules. MEI, it's defined in different modules, and you can see that different notation types, for example, common Western music, common music notation, mensual notation, and neum notation are different modules. So it's not that if using MEI, you get all the neums and all that. You can select what you'd like to use, and it's also meant to use more or less everything at the same time, even though it's not directly recommended. There is one module on scholarly editions. That's where we can encode critical notes and so on. And if you're interested into sound, there's temporal and linking. There's MIDI-like structures, names, dates, and so on. So fairly wide range. It's also very flexible. So these modules can be selected, can be modified. If you have a project that want to use MEI in a different way, add things, then you can process all the source with the modification you want to add. It's called customization, following the TI approach. And then it generates a schema that you can use. Of course, the idea, because it's community-based, is that you have a very good addition, modification, customization. Then you should discuss it with the community, and hopefully this will become part of the core, because it's never good to have your own little customization remaining for long-term maintenance, because it creates complication for maintaining your project. Right, so very basic encoding. Sorry to show you some XML code, but I think it's difficult to avoid. That's just one note, right? So we've got the note element, an attribute that say this is the pitch, the octave, and the duration, and you can add dot attribute, and you get that. So what's important here is that that's basically one letter of the alphabet, and you can see that for coding music notation, we have to structure, think, and be pretty verbose for representing one little element that's part of the music notation. Then it's structural. This can be combined. We can define a beam element that contains note, and so on, right? If we have a slur, and that's where, of course, you might discuss, is XML really appropriate, because we have a lot of overlapping hierarchy, and slurs are a common one. Two measures. Measure is one element. If you want to have a slur that goes across the two slurs, you have to put it in a way outside the hierarchy, and that's where we use pointer to say, okay, I'm beginning here, and that's the end of the slur. Typical issues that makes, in a way, representing music notation fairly complex.
So slurs, despite being a sort of a global operation of notes, sit outside the definition of notes. I mean, the notes sit outside the definition of the slur. The slur does not encompass its form as the notes, but is an add-on.
It's in that case, how it's encoded here, it's outside, and it points to note. But it can also point to a timestamp if you have a slur that's not precisely attached to a note, for example. There's different ways in MEI, there's nearly always different ways to encode the same thing, because you need some flexibility, right?
But
so
staccato and legato are treated differently.
Sorry?
Staccato and legato are treated differently than in the notation. Legato will come as a slur.
Yes.
Separate from the notes, while the dots appear on the note.
Yes, but dot can also be an element. So there's, that depends how you want to structure your information. But that's certainly one case where you cannot have a slur that stays in the hierarchy, because it does overlap several elements in the hierarchy. That's the main point of this example. I briefly mentioned scholarly editing, and what's important here is to illustrate one concept, which is a way of encoding several versions in parallel. And that's highly used in critical editing, where we want to encode different variants. And how this is done, if you've got two sources that show a variant at some point, we have one encoding, and at some point it's divided. So this is called parallel segmentation, with a specific element that's apt for a critical note. And then it's divided, and both versions are encoded. So what's interesting here is that we can, if we think about a critical edition, we have the logic of the critical edition that's encoded, and not, as we usually have, a score somewhere, and then a text file that's completely unrelated that refers to measures. Here, there's a logical that's implemented and encoded. So the main point here is this parallel segmentation that can be used for critical notes, but also for other purposes. So, in a way, we can say that text, because it's monodimensional, it's fairly straightforward to process. For example, if you want to compare two versions of the text, right, we use these type of tools quite often. Diff, so we align the text and highlight the differences. If we want to do something similar for music, because of this structure, it's quite complex and not easy, right? So the structural nature of music notation makes this representation problematic and difficult. And reading, I've been working quite a lot of OMR, reading the music, what actually we do when we read the music, or what we do when we read the music by computer too. It's basically going from a graphical domain to a logical domain, right? So I had one example of a note here that gives just one pitch. I said the pitch is C, and the octave is 4. Actually, I know that because I read what's before, and it can be interpreted only because I know it's a G clef. And I also know that it's a sharp because actually there is a sharp before in the measure. So, right? I need to know that. I need to go get the clef, get the key. Then I go here. I see that it's natural, but then again, and then I can get it. So the question is, when you encode this, do you want to store this information that there's a sharp on this note, or do you want to leave the tool guess it, which is possible, right? So the final the question there is, how far do you process your data when you code your music, when you go from this graphical domain to this logical domain? And here there's a lot of room to play, and that's things we constantly need to evaluate. First of all, what is the purpose of the encoding? How far do we need to go? Where do we stand in this intermediate area? As I mentioned earlier, MEI makes the distinction between the domains. If you don't explicitly in what domain you're acting, it creates some confusion. Can the tools be adjusted to do some part of this processing? Right? As I said, to understand that the note has a sharp, this can be left to the tool to some extent, but maybe somebody wants to have this in the encoding, so why? Or can we leave this to the tool? And also, are the common practice always appropriate? If we have different types of material, this can be questioned. And that's where I'd like to look at some aspect of the Renaissance music to illustrate this problematic. So to give a little bit of background, this is a part book of the Renaissance. So there are a few particularities that I need to mention. That's, first of all, that the score doesn't exist. We get this music as part books. And in order to get a sense of what's the work, these parts need to be put together, transcribed, and aligned, right? So that's what we have in many libraries. And we want to get a score and be able to listen to this piece, which we can do now. Very nice piece. So in order to get that, we need to align these different voices. And actually, the duration are quite tricky in Renaissance notation. And the reason why we want to do that not by hand, to give you also a little bit of background and context, is that we've got a project that does large-scale OMR, so where we want to automate, in a way, make this project automatic as much as possible. So with the large-scale idea that we recognize these scores and then encode them and make them searchable, processable in an automatic way as much as possible. So this is the SIMSA project that's conducted at McGill in Montreal. And the idea is really to create a large OMR framework, including for this type of repertoire. So, duration in mensual notation. Why is it tricky? It's in fact that the division is not just given by the symbol, but it's given by a proportion sign that acts in a way as a duration clef. Right? So you really need to look at the context in order to understand what are the division and the duration. And in a way, we can say that traditionally in music encoding, the Renaissance music has been wrongly treated as binary because, I mean, at the beginning, the music was ternary. Perfectum means perfect, ternary. Imperfect is binary. So there is this assumption in music encoding that all the music should be binary, including Renaissance music. And that leads to basically trying to fit something in a box where it's actually not the right box, right? So if you look, this is taken from the Plain and Easy Treatise printed in London by Morley, so if I'm not wrong. And typically, that's the CMME encoding to store the duration. So all the duration, the problem is that all the duration are traditionally hard-coded in a way. And the duration of this note is explicitly given by 3 of these 3 semiminim, right? And actually, the problem is that normally the division is ternary. I mean, it can be binary or ternary. Here it's made imperfectum, so 2, 2, 2, but here it's perfectum, it's perfect, so we've got 3. That's given by this little dot. So this little sign acts as a duration clef, right? So instead of encoding the duration, what we can do fairly easily, and we do that in MEI, is that we just actually encode the clef here. Say we've got a mod that's imperfect, imperfect, tempo is imperfect, and prolation perfect, the little dot, and that's what we get. And we see that's 2, 2, 2, and then 3, right? And then we can change. Here we've got a perfection here, and that then automatically changes to 1, 2, 4, 12, and 36. And the main point is that actually the equivalence level normally is given by the brief. So in the previous encoding, we had the equivalence level given by the shortest value, and that doesn't work. It's just wrong, right? So here we've got a way that we removed all the hard-coded values in the notes. We just need to know that this is a maxima, a long brief, and so on. And then we just interpret the signs, and that works actually perfectly well, right? So this shows that how we can actually delegate a lot of the encoding to the tools, exactly in the same way we do it when we read the music. Taking another example, which is void notation that we get at the late 17th century. And that's really a legacy from this colored notation in a way. And we don't know exactly why it was used, but we know it was important. The music printers really try to find the font when typesetting this. Here it's engraved, and it's preserved. And it's actually pretty difficult to represent if you use music notation software, because we have a gap in the durations. From here, where it's the same, but there's no quarter notes. Right, from the we have this colored 8th note, which is then the equivalent of a quarter note. So there's really a dichotomy between the visual domain and gestural domain, but only from a certain point. And this has been a typical case where it's actually extremely difficult to get this appropriately represented with music notation software, because this distinction between the two domains is not done. And actually, it's also interesting for us in MEI because it's a case where we're between 2 different modules. If you remember, we had the CMN and the mensual, and here we're a little bit in between. So it was an interesting case to experiment with to see how can we work between the boundaries. Because, as I said, the music notation evolves, and it's not that one day you say, OK, now it's the end of mensual, we're going to start CMN. We get all these things that pass across the period, and that's a very good example. And actually, it was pretty surprising pretty simple to do this. Again, because first of all, we can include the coloration from dimensional module. And then we just need to specify the different domains in which we act and encode. And we say we've got a duration of an eighth. So that's an eighth note. That's colored. That's empty. But in the gestual domain, we've got the duration of a quarter note. And actually, that's it. It works perfectly well, just because we clearly know in what domain we're acting. And I was pretty surprised to see that we can do that easily when we know where we are. So if we go back here to this illustration, it should always be explicit in what domain you're acting, even though it's might be still difficult to know, but at least when you know, you should clearly do it. And that helps structuring the encoding quite a lot. So what we've seen here also, too, is that differently from music XML, it's really good to think encoding as a modeling, not think away from the tools. And once we got the data, when we explicitly have structured the data, we can think of the tool. And also then make good tools that reduce the encoding, as we can see here. So there's really this tradition of trying to put everything in the encoding without clearly saying what it is, and then it becomes extremely difficult to handle. That's one goal of MEI, is to clarify all that. Right? And of course, as I said, with these uncommon sources, we also always have surprises, and we need to be able to question a little bit the practices we have. Now, I'd like to finish this talk by looking at this part, which is the rendering process, and what can we do with this model. So with MEI, we try to question and we think how we represent the music notation, how we model it. And then the next step is what can we do with this model, and that's what we do with some tools we develop. So one of these processes, as provided before, is that we want to render this, right? We encode this, and we want then to render the music notation in a digital edition, in a web application, and so on. And one problem we have is that most of the rendering of music notation by computers has been done in desktop application. Right? Music notation software are very powerful, very complex tools for rendering the music, but they're really desktop application target printed output, so you would do your engraving, do your text, and then print it to PDF or PostScript, for example. And in a way, we can say they really try to mimic the engraving and also engraving output, which is basically paper. So this is code that we cannot really reuse in a way. Because it's not meant to be modular, not meant to be portable, very often commercial. So that's a little bit a difficult situation. Now, there are some new tools, and that's really something we're targeting with this type of modeling, is target the web application. Right? There's more and more possibility to publish the music on the web. And there are some interesting libraries, and we're actually developing one that aims at making possible to publish MEI data directly on the web. Now, together with this idea of rendering, we also try to think in terms of interaction. There are certainly quite some work that's been done on that, especially in music composition environment. I'm not very familiar, but I know that there's quite some work that's been done there. Very often there, the music notation is considered as a graphical object where you can add also different things, and of course live and dynamic on-the-fly processing is very important. Music notation applications, again, that's some sort of interaction, but not directly useful. And we also have in MIR application typical cases where it's used, but in that case I would say most of the time is unidirectional. So you make, for example, you make a query and you want to display results. So that's in one direction. So you go from the encoding to the display of the notation. So the project we're developing takes a little bit a different approach by the fact that we want something that's very modular. So we don't want to create the ultimate desktop application or the application for that, but just a little piece of software. So in terms of design, say, for this to be useful on a wide scope, we think very small. And actually, it's a very small C++ library with no dependency that's compiled for different platforms and fairly application agnostic. So in the same way that MEI is application agnostic in terms of musicology application, Berovio is fairly agnostic in terms of computer application. So the applications will need to be built on top of that. Right. Now the other thing we achieve is we try to produce an output that is not meant to be just unidirectional, but that preserves the structure of the encoding. With MEI, we try to model the mix notation, so our approach is to produce something that preserves that for further interaction. And as I said, the idea is then we try to see the rendering not as a unidirectional process, but the rendering as a process that creates a layer in between what you see and what's on the back. So for this, we use SVG, which is another XML format, vectorial graphic. And the rendering is not producing the output, but creating this layer. And then we can create interaction on top of that. So I'll finish with this example back. Sorry, it's not too easy to illustrate like that, but if we go back to our void notation example, you remember we had void notation here. So that summarizes a little bit different things. We have here a parallel segmentation. We've got here an encoding that says, OK, I want maybe at some point to have both versions. The original one, which is the one with the coloration and the both gestural and visual domain, and a regular version, which is just short durations, right? And in this rendering, we selected that one. And the idea of this tool is to generate an SVG, so a structure, where actually the information about the existing alternate is there. So it's not visible here, but behind in this structure, we have actually a reference to this little thing over there. Right? So you don't see it, but all the information is preserved. And of course, that works with IDs, which I didn't put in the XML to keep it as light as possible. But we can generate data where basically the structure is there, including the structure of the data that's not displayed. And I think it's a fairly interesting basis for creating interaction between music encoding and the visual realization of it. And that's actually it for me. There is here a few links to where actually is MEI if you're interested. There's a website, there's a mailing list, and there's even a GitHub for people who really want to put your hands in that. Thank you very much for your attention.